Robert, thank you very much indeed. And it's, I must say, a pleasure always to come and talk to the Urban Design Group, and particularly about the Essex Design Guide. Because I suspect that the Essex Design Guide, which I think I'm right, slightly preceded the setting up of the Urban Design Group, but must have been one of the generators in all sorts of indirect ways. Right, that was slow. Let me just get used to that. The Architect's Journal welcomed the first version when it came out in 1973, 35 and a half years ago, roughly, as something that should shape and help form our future thinking about architecture. And they saw it as important as the roads in urban areas that at the time was really dictating actually so much urban design, and possibly even as important as Verzian architecture. That wasn't generally altogether accepted. It actually created a complete division at the time. And what I'm going to do tonight is to look a little bit at the history of how it came about, why it came about, what shaped it, but actually with a point of looking forward. We're at the point in Essex now where we're looking at the next generation of guide. I'll pick up the detail in between as we go. But what guidance should be in the future, now that we have CABE, we have Homes and Communities Agency, we have, some would say, too much guidance. So where do we go from here? How do we deal with regional guidance? So although I'm going to be starting by looking backwards, I'd like to think that this is very much about the future, and that this group that has always had so much to do with the shaping of current design thinking could really play a part in it. So let me just set the current context and perhaps the next 10 years. We're going to see a lot of growth in the southeast, 100,000 new homes in Essex, adding to the 1.4 million we already have. Key issues are the numbers over 65. I mean, we've now passed the point for the first time ever in the United Kingdom that we have more people over 50 and under it. For the first time ever, we're no longer a young population. And I'm not sure that's been fully absorbed. I might have a stake in that, and that might be an issue, but nevertheless. 30% of us living alone, 1 in 9 move every year. I mean, I think those are some of the key issues. I mean, this CABE statistic I like, because I believe, and sort of this feels right to me whenever I talk to people out there, they are interested in the environment. Actually, the community is immensely sophisticated about the environment and about planning. And one of the real problems is that there is no way in to most planning issues for the community without making a complaint. And one of the great achievements of the original Essex Design Guide was that it broke out of that. But I'll come back to it. A county. What is a county? Well, in some ways, counties were Victorian, 19th century creations. They gave us a lot of the original structure, the boundaries, and so on. Today, we have a different sort of decision-making structure. But again, putting this in context, because design guidance today, and certainly design guidance in the future, is very much about working through the system. And I think that's one of the key issues. Essex itself, of course, was always one of those gateway counties. We talk about the Thames Gateway now, but actually, and depending on how far you go back when the area was joined to Germany, it's a county that was very well travelled over. Archaeology, the fragments of previous generations are very, very much in evidence there. And I think sometimes to see this view of it just reminds us of it's a county with the second longest coastline in the UK, which is something I didn't associate particularly with it. Another way of characterising, thinking about this, and it's John Constable at the end, as you've guessed, is one of the great painters, I mean, slightly over the border, arguably, but painting the landscape, and again, setting everybody's perception of what that county is. Never ceases to amaze me when one works in planning in the UK and deals with essentially very dense areas. In European terms, we're dealing with high density almost everywhere. And yet one talks to the public, one certainly talks to councillors, key decision makers, and almost inevitably they feel that their region is rural. And what they're looking at is the green and preserving it. And as a technical planner, you're doing something else. In Essex's case, actually, another surprise for me when I got there is that 70, arguably 80% still is rural. What a lot of us perceive of Essex is, of course, South Essex, the Basildons, the Colchesters, the southern urban London edge. The landscape, of course, was given shape by the underlying form. You can't really decipher that from where you're sitting, but it's about chalk, upper green sand and galt. It's the materials that gave the starting point to the materials we now see. I mean, on the right, the examples, a timber building. But of course, the county was heavily wooded. Queen Elizabeth I took something like 2 weeks to cross it, I understand. No doubt she was partying a bit on the way, but it was heavily wooded, and you still see the pattern of settlements built out of woods, single roads, single strips, very much in evidence, but of course most of the woods have gone. So again, it's a county that has taken change. Particularly, I think this diagram, set of diagrams, shows urban growth. London going through that enormous expansion through to 2000. And you can see where local communities come from when they're faced with this degree of change, this sort of overwhelming degree of urbanisation. And back in 1973, the chairman of the planning committee was saying few people in Essex are happy with the form of post-war housing development. And there's a photograph that is a fair representation of an awful lot of what was going on. I think, looking around the audience, I suspect many of us, if not most of us, were around in 1973. And it's sometimes difficult to go back, but enormous similarities, I feel, today. Planning at one of those crossroads. Current planning system seems to have got itself terribly badly tangled up. Decision-making within the public sector needed sorting out. And I think arguably it does again today, and yet the form was sort of not very good. Design guidance. I'm just going to look back a little bit, design guidance before 1970, because I think this is the route that set up the thinking that gave us that 1973 guide. I mean, Garden City movement is sort of all pervasive. That interwar period, the end of the 19th century, gave us, of course, the high points that we take as garden cities, but actually gave us in a very corrupted form the Beaconsfields, the London overspill, a lot of that stuff that came out in the 30s that was a very downgraded version of the original concept. I'll come on to the other two. But I actually went back to Unwin's 1909 copy of Town Planning in Practice, which is a fascinating book. I mean, I don't know whether you can read the contents there, but the contents were remarkably broad, and even the language of civic art as the expression of civic life. And here is and this went through 20 or 30 editions, and this sort of language of formal and informal beauty, you know, words that we're too embarrassed to use these days, of city survey. I mean, within this was the fundamentals of planning. There's another document about the same time. I was looking to have a copy of the second edition of the Town and Country Planning Association collection. I think it's for 1911. And when you go through that, of course, planning didn't really exist. I mean, the people writing it, the Abercrombies and so on, were architects. There was a strong sociological input into that. But the breadth of thinking was absolutely amazing. They were talking about gateways, objects, if you like, beautifying cities at the same time as electrification coming in and the impact. And in my copy, there's a huge thing on Grand Central Station in New York, a lovely cutaway section, transport interchange, how an underground, a subway could interrelate to buses and trains. I mean, we forget much, much more than we remember. But I think the other thing about this guide was that sort of Edwardian summer of 1909, you know, one looks at the literature of that period, the illustrations of that period, the sort of the certainty of drawing. But actually that period was also facing what we face now. I mean, a huge expansion to the suburbs. I mean, stockbrokers were being complained about because they were building in the middle of really strong open countryside, villas that we've now probably listed. But it was the march of the middle classes that was beginning to really overwhelm. And these guys sort of understood that, but they also had within them, I think, a creativity that, again, we've sort of slightly lost sight of. I mean, that railway bridge, the bottom drawing there, is, despite its antique qualities, is a terrific way of looking at transport infrastructure and creating place. You know, this is the entrance to Letchworth Garden City, you know, a proper gateway. But the guide itself, the book itself, really probably gained its strength from the chapters on highway planning, on drainage, and lots of diagrams that looked at the width of road in a very almost Germanic analytical way. But it's those diagrams that gave us the highway engineering that actually marched across the interwar period. And that drawing on the left set up a quality that works in Hampstead Garden suburb, but actually began to put up problems, I feel, with the architecture about individuality that really got lost very much at the beginning of the modern movement. And just by way of change, I mean, they were influenced very much. I mean, just to go back, I mean, Unwin was very much influenced by City, and there's a whole chapter on his version of City's analysis of German medieval towns. And at the same time, Eliel Saarinen was doing something very similar. And his work at the same, and you can see his drawings there from 1915, his earlier drawings were the same, taking City's urban analysis, but actually coming up with a much more urban solution. And it's around about here that we began to diverge from mainland Europe. Mainland Europe going forward with city living, city building, and an enormous humanity of city. In the UK, the same humanity, the same social driver, but going down a different route of suburbia at lower density. Somehow, because we got to the Industrial Revolution early, our cities were something you got out of, whereas in places like Helsinki, the Industrial Revolution never even quite got there. And when it did, it was outside of them. And so I think, again, one of the strands that we deal with still is this divergence. And then, of course, there was the critique of the period. Ian Nairn, driving around England in his Morris Minor Traveller, outrage and SOS, stop press. A terrifically influential period for the Architectural Review, when it was showcasing some really elegant work and just looking at, those terrific black and white photographs, the quality of the writers, the quality of the writing, and yet still this critique coming through that we as a country in that post-war period, for all sorts of reasons, were being totally cavalier about our built environment. It doesn't seem to be built into the UK psyche somehow that without an enormous amount of pressure we naturally put effort into sorting it out. Gordon Cullen, of course, was working with the Mars Group and others, and I think actually is a very interesting person. Worked with him very briefly, and it was always a huge pleasure to do that. But I think he had two impacts here. I mean, firstly, he was able to ditch some of the interwar and the pre-war thinking with a very clear graphic style that was actually very copyable. I can say, I remember going through architecture school where everyone could sort of do a Gordon Cullen tree, and it was the way in which one expressed spatial thinking when you were trying to find your way of getting there. He also introduced the dynamic, which I think is important in all sorts of ways, that it's not big static set pieces we deal with. We're actually having to shape. And when we shape, we have to look into the future. The difficulty with Gordon Cullen, of course, is that I always felt he was unbuildable in reality. The idea is quite elusive. but underneath it was a very English humanity. I think, again, to bring this up to 1973, one of the things that I was reminded of when I looked at this and was looking at Harlow, Harlow a little earlier, but they would be building in 1973, and Basildon was the same. Actually rather interesting architectural plans, and there were a lot of these. It's when you, if you can see them, when you look at the detail of the elevations, that you get a different concept coming across. And you're reminded that we were building 100% rented housing. This was mostly social housing. I was in Milton Keynes in 1973, and we were working on grid squares in the town centre. And the big innovation was that we were having to absorb 50% private housing. And that was having a huge impact on how you began to manage the private sector that didn't have a reputation for doing this. This was architecture, but architecture had gone down this very social route, with exceptions. And of course, Eric Lyons and Span was the great exception. New Ash Green there. Again, a delightfully humane environment, although architecturally odd, one has to say if one goes back. Issues of privacy, very, very architectural, single streets. A tree canopy that is so overgrown that again, not for me, I feel not one of those things. Blackheath, and let me not go into Span, but I mean Blackheath and Span I feel is much more generic and much more general. There are issues here about the way in which architects take a brief and come up with something that is so specific.